My name is Lance Holbert. I'm at Temple University. I want to thank Seoul National University for inviting me to take part in this misinformation symposium. The title for my talk today is Misinformation in U.S. Elections, a Long and Sordid History. I'm a social scientist by trade, studying persuasion as communicative acts. But I'm going to begin with adopting more of a historical lens to this particular topic, and then I will turn back to more of a social science persuasion-oriented lens. I'm looking forward to giving the talk here today, as well as hearing the input provided by the other scholars as part of the symposium. Before I begin, it's important that I make clear that I'm using the term misinformation as all-inclusive. This includes disinformation, online and offline propagandistic procedures and activities, hyperpartisan news, fake news, clickbait, rumors, conspiracy theories. It's exceedingly important, as Tucker and colleagues outline in their William and Flora Hewitt Foundation report, that there needs to be an explication of these concepts. Someone needs to sit down and really systematically go through and develop meaning analysis for each, show how they're unique relative to one another. Otherwise, there's going to be some clear ceiling effects in terms of the validity of the insights provided by all the activities being undertaken, as well as that would provide some organizational power to show how these different types of communicative acts relate to one another relative to these larger campaigns that are ongoing. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm a social scientist who studies persuasion. But with regard to this topic, I keep on returning to the need to provide some historical context relative to how misinformation and disinformation has played itself out in American politics. Now, my initial degree in undergraduate is in history. So I do have a history degree, but by no means am I a historian. Nevertheless, I think it's exceedingly important to adopt this historical lens to place what we're currently studying in an appropriate context. And I think RID's recent work provides some sense of the importance of this kind of historical lens. So I'm going to begin here with kind of an epistemological shift from the social science and kind of quantitative lens I usually take to more of a historical, humanistic lens. Thanks. So my general argument is that American presidential elections and American politics have a long history with misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, hyperpartisan news, fake news, rumors, and conspiracy theories. The history associated with these types of communicative acts actually is, I would say, is far longer than for objective news, neutrality of information, deliberation, those types of processes and procedures. So this history is not particularly pretty, it's not particularly noble, but I think it's an important part of our discussion. Certainly the pace and pattern of these communicative activities are influenced by a digital age. We also have a digital residue that allows us to see them unfold and that they retain in a digital form their substance over a longer period of time. But on the human side, what motivates people to create these messages, what's motivating these types of activities, has remained fairly constant over time. There's many different examples that could be given relative to these types of communication activities relative to American history. But we're living in a particularly turbulent time right now, unfortunately, and it may get worse before it gets better in the coming months and years. But I thought that to keep things kind of constant, we would focus on other turbulent times, because those are the moments where the disinformation and misinformation seems to be particularly powerful. I'm sure in less turbulent times, there is a similar set of communication dynamics at play. But let's try to focus on other points in history that are similar to what we're seeing at the moment in terms of the unrest and the violence and the emotion that exists in the 2020 election cycle. So let's begin with the ratification of the Articles of Confederation. There was a realization that the nation needed a new path forward of how it's going to govern itself. And so with the Constitutional Convention, there was a lot of discussion of the role of the federal government versus the role of the states. And the Federalist Papers are defined and the most often consumed relative to the argument for the nature of the U.S. Constitution that we now have as a living document. But I want to point out that there is also the Anti-Federalist Papers. And so if we want to go and take a look at examples of disinformation and misinformation, I would encourage a read of the Anti-Federalist Papers. They were not as well organized as the Federalist Papers. They did not have the same reach as the Federalist Papers. But as the Zelensky piece in 2012 makes known, they've had a staying power in the sense that one, they are used by the far-right organizations within the United States in that particular movement, as well as within U.S. Supreme Court decisions by conservative justices to back up their particular claims and their arguments of what was the original intent of the U.S. Constitution. Given the popularity of the musical Hamilton, we might as well begin with the election of 1800. With people in the mix such as John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, along with Hamilton and Aaron Burr, it was an exceedingly difficult time for the nation. Mass political parties were first being created. They had very different visions for where the country needed to go. The accusations that were thrown at both Adams and Jefferson during the course of the election in terms of the questioning of Adams' manhood, as well as claims for Thomas Jefferson that stealing of land, stealing of property, being an atheist at a time when that was probably the worst thing that you could say about another human being. That a piece by Lurch back in 1948 described how the goal of the campaigns were to destroy public confidence in a candidate by all manner of criticism, just or unjust, true or false. Sounds very much like what we see in much of today's campaigning. We like to place on a pedestal people like Adams and Jefferson and Hamilton, but we do have to recognize that all of these folks and their political parties willingly embraced and engaged in acts of misinformation. One of the next most difficult periods for in American history was with the American Civil War. And if we look at the build-up to the war, if you look at the 1856 election, and if you look at the rhetoric and what was being called for by what was at that time the American Party, or what is known as the Know-Nothings at that time, of, armed oversight of polling places, much of that activity and what was being called for at that time mirrors Trump's Republican Party. I would say that there's a number of different similarities that exist between the activities of the Know-Nothings and the populist rhetoric that exists within Trump's current Republican Party. So if we look at something like the 1960 election and the myriad of claims that were made about Abraham Lincoln and his heritage and what he was calling for and what would happen to the nation as a result of his election, if we look at something even like the reaction in the American Southeast after Harper's Ferry, and so the idea of where the freedom movement was going and the abolitionists, what they were calling for, there's been historical works done on the newspaper editorials of that time in that particular area of the world, talking about the fact that they create hysteria, the divisiveness that was created, very, very difficult times. and the idea that misinformation, disinformation can be used to spark emotions, cajole certain behavioral responses, creating calls to action, not just the individual, but also the macro social level. So the idea of the calling for civil war. And so the rhetoric of that time and the conspiracy theories that are associated with that time are very well detailed by works by Michael William Pfau and others. Here are some other examples for some difficult times. One, during Reconstruction, Confederate soldier idolatry and the myth of the lost cause. It really was a sustained propaganda effort to change the way in which people in the American South viewed the Civil War. And so the recent manifestation of that is still playing itself out in the Confederate statue debates and the taking down of these statues relative to what they represent to African Americans and other minority groups within the country. The Spanish-American War, things like Remember the Maine, which was a completely constructed event in order to spark the desire for the country to go to war. It was a completely fictitious event that ultimately led the nation to go forth and engage in this military exercise, but on completely false pretenses. Then if we look at something like World War II, if we're going to think about foreign interference, it's well documented the British government would plant false public polling information saying that the Americans were much more in favor of taking part in World War II than they actually were, in order to influence the 1944 election, to make sure that someone was elected that would be more willing for the Americans to take part in that particular conflict. If we look at the 1960 election, there's seemingly endless number of conspiracy theories associated with John F. Kennedy and his family and how he was able to rise to power, how they built their fortune, how he was elected president, became a senator earlier than that. And so those are outlined full well in historical context, and even different theories are offered relative to how and why certain conspiracy theories take hold. And the Usinski and Parent work offers some detail relative to those. But even after the election of 1960, those conspiracy theories took hold and they were able to build up, and in certain volatile, one-sided message environments like Dallas, Texas in 1963, they were really at a fever pitch. And, there were warnings that were given to John Kennedy prior to making his Dallas visit that it was not a place where they felt particularly for him to be safe. There's a recent work by Mintelagio and Davis called Dallas 1963 that outlines the message environment of Dallas at that time, in particularly conservative talk radio. And within it, they're outlining information, disinformation, that really was prominent within that particular media market at that particular time, so much so that it really dominated almost what was one-sided environment, and were able to get people into a fever pitch and sparked even more of the negative emotions that kind of defined that time and ultimately had a horrible outcome. Now, as much as I'm building up an argument that things really haven't changed all that much, it is important for us to recognize that the misinformation operations of the digital age are extraordinary in size. I would encourage everybody to give a read to Philip Howard's recent Lie Machines, which gives some detail of just how many people are at work in Russia, in China, in Iran, relative to the construction of misinformation and the spreading of disinformation. While all of that is at play, and especially in detailing how muddy the water is, let's say, in a U.S. Election environment, communication environment, it's also important for us to recognize that America takes part in disinformation and misinformation campaigns as well in different parts of the world, and trying to detail those in some way is an important piece of information in this discussion. There's no question that there's new processes and procedures at play that allow a propagandist or someone whose trade is misinformation or disinformation to be able to try out new activities. So something like beta testing, where you can try out 20 or 30 different message strategies and see which one takes hold in terms of sharing, liking, clicking, all the different behaviors that you're able to track as audience activity in a digital environment. That is certainly new. There's no question about that. So the pace and the pattern and the nature by which these activities take place, there is something unique about the digital environment. But what I'm trying to stress here is that this didn't all start in the digital age. So the historical portion of my talk is leading me to make a claim that the human side of generating misinformation to achieve various goals, whether those goals are to spark extreme behavior, sow distrust, magnify societal cleavages, institutional delegitimization, that has not changed. That has been around for as long as the nation has been a nation. It's one with its history, and I think that's very important to recognize as we think about current research activities about what is going on in the misinformation, disinformation arena in 2020. In terms of actual messaging and the origins of that messaging in terms of human beings, I find that there's a great deal of consistency, and I'm not sure there's all that much new here in 2020 relative to years previous. All right, with the historical portion of my talk now completed, I want to return to a more familiar hat as a social scientist and thinking about misinformation from a persuasion lens. So oftentimes in the study of persuasion, we look at the main communication inputs, the 5 inputs of message, source, recipient, channel, and context. But those 5 inputs could just as easily be called the 5 miscommunication inputs, in that any particular miscommunication activity and its potential influence is a combination of these 5 components. So I would like to focus on a particular point relative to each of the 5 to close out my talk here today. On the message side of things, it has long been argued in the study of propaganda that any good propaganda campaign is a mix of what has come to be defined as white, gray, and black propaganda. I didn't come up with those terms, but that's what they are defined as. So white propaganda is accurate information provided by a true source, whereas gray and black is some combination of inaccurate information and or false sources. And the idea is that no one campaign can be built strictly on false information or false sources, that there needs to be some in the mix, the message mix, there needs to be accurate sources providing accurate information to provide some legitimacy to the disinformation or misinformation that's either coming from real sources or constructed sources. And that the idea of they work in combination with one another. In the study of disinformation and misinformation, I see a lot of work that is focused on looking at disinformation and misinformation in isolation to, or in a vacuum from, relative to accurate pieces of information, accurate sources that are also working in combination with this disinformation and misinformation. I do believe that there actually are complementary effects. What the white propaganda can do, its strengths and weaknesses are addressed in accordance with the gray and black propaganda and vice versa. So beginning to think about what is offered as false information or from false sources, we need to look at what is being constructed from accurate sources with accurate information, working in combination with those other communicative activities. To study only the gray or black propaganda, the misinformation, disinformation in a vacuum, it tells us something, but looking at those activities in a vacuum relative to the accurate information from accurate sources within a larger campaign is limiting. We really need to expand the range of the sources that we're taking a look at as well. Now, with the digital age and the infinite increase or exponential increase in the number of channels, certainly people are beginning to do so. But I want to make known that there have been sources of disinformation and misinformation in traditional media as well, long-standing ones, that we've really just never studied or never have taken a look at, but that are extremely important. So a good example coming out of a recent piece by Jeff Bain looks at the US tabloid press. And so Bain makes an argument in his work that the National Enquirer, which you find in supermarkets while you're waiting in line to buy whatever food you're going to buy, has engaged in a decades-long information campaign to present Donald J. Trump as being presidential. The study of political communication, the study of misinformation, disinformation, oftentimes is focused on legitimate sources, or the very fact that as this was occurring over the 1980s and 1990s, there was no formal scholarly study of something like the National Enquirer. We were oftentimes only studying, legitimate, highbrow, high-end sources, the types of sources that we ourselves read or watch. But it's important to recognize that the audience is quite diverse in what it's consuming, and to look at these more kind of lowbrow mass media outlets that do engage in disinformation and misinformation is extremely important. Bain makes a very good argument that the National Enquirer played a key role in sustaining this idea of Donald J. Trump as being presidential. In thinking about the audience for misinformation and disinformation, I think it's important to recognize that some of the most insidious and most effective campaigns seem to be working off of that which already exists in the country. So a lot of the misinformation, disinformation, and propagandistic activities coming out of Russia are focusing on American racial relations, which is a troubled history, one that has gone unresolved. And building off of those tensions, they're able to sow chaos, create more unrest. This information, disinformation, misinformation is not coming out of nowhere. It's building off of that which pre-existed. And so to not recognize this is to give too much power to the misinformation and disinformation. There may be times when the disinformation and misinformation campaigns are building off of less that is pre-existing, but oftentimes the ones that are able to take hold are basically working with the low-hanging fruit. That which already is problematic in the nation, they're simply going to utilize those difficulties and try to build upon them to create greater unrest, to create greater unease. So in thinking about channel, this is where the digital media era really comes into play. So the very fact that the digital environment does not recognize physical borders naturally creates a greater opening for foreign interference on domestic political affairs. And As much as we do that, we need to recognize also, though, with channels of influence, that this is not just taking place in a digital media environment or in social media. There are traditional channels and traditional media genres that are being utilized to further disinformation and misinformation. So there's a great piece coming out by Howard and Eswa in Journal of Communication in the October 2020 issue that focuses on RT, and those were interviews with journalists who work at RT. And there's a lot of discussion about the nature of what is the underlying motivations of that particular source, what purpose they serve relative to other activities, communication activities that are taking place. So this is, as much as the digital environment does, of course, create new opportunities, there still needs to be recognition that traditional media sources play their own unique role as well, and that ultimately, at the end of the day, these different channels work to complement one another relative to achieving someone's larger goals, like the ones that were mentioned earlier in this talk. Finally, in terms of context, it's very important that when we think about disinformation and misinformation relative to the 2020 U.S. election, that we need a clear understanding of what was at work in 2016 as well. What were the motivating factors behind those disinformation and misinformation activities? How did they unfold? What were the nature of their effects? Not just on the mass public, but also on elites like James Comey and others in terms of making certain decisions that could indeed impact that particular election, as well as looking previous to 2016. So the activities of Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State relative to Vladimir Putin, relative to the Russian oligarchs during the Obama administration, all play a role relative to how disinformation and misinformation played out in 2016 and with what we're seeing now in 2020. I wanted to close again by just offering a message of thanks to Seoul National University for allowing me to take part in the symposium. I'm very much looking forward to the other talks and the subsequent exchange we have on this exceedingly important topic. I hope all of you are well and staying safe, and please remain so until the point at which we can get together, even just virtually, in order to discuss this very important topic.